Occultism Intuition Dialogue Cleanup. You philosopher, you take it or leave it. The structure of inward apprehension. Original question. What's the biggest misconception people have about esoteric mastery? The exact question asked in the conversation. What's the biggest misconception people have about esoteric mastery? The wording matters because this was the actual question that initiated the exchange. Nothing should be substituted, paraphrased, or replaced because the context and symbolic framing emerge from the precise sequence of words used in the dialogue. There is also an important distinction in how the question was received. The spoken word mastery was heard as mystery, and the first response arose from that hearing. That matters because esoteric mastery points toward attainment, discipline, development, and command over symbolic systems, while esoteric mystery points toward hiddenness, the unknown, veiling, revelation, paradox, and the fear people project onto what they do not understand. So the original response belongs more naturally to the received question of esoteric mystery, even though the exact question asked was esoteric mastery. This difference must remain visible because changing one word changes the symbolic direction of the answer. The response. The biggest misconception is that people think it's automatically the devil. They become superstitious, immature, fearful. Everything becomes wicked, evil, bad, simply because they do not understand it. Human beings have a tendency to fear what they do not know, and then try to destroy it before understanding it. Instead of penetrating the symbol, they react to it emotionally. Instead of exploring the unknown, they condemn it. The label becomes a defense mechanism against uncertainty. This is not limited to occultism. Humanity does this with philosophy, cultures, discoveries, paradigms, mystical systems, hidden teachings, altered states of consciousness, symbols, rituals, and anything else that destabilizes certainty. Once something exists outside the accepted mental framework of society, people instinctively attempt to imprison it with language. Evil, dangerous, devil, forbidden. Because once they successfully label it, they no longer feel obligated to investigate it. The deeper issue is that intellect, emotion, and intuition are not the same faculty. Intellect analyzes symbols. Emotion reacts to symbols. But intuition penetrates symbols directly. That is why two people can stand before the exact same esoteric image, doctrine, ritual, or philosophical system and emerge with entirely different conclusions. One reacts emotionally, this frightens me. Another reacts intellectually, this system means X according to this structure. But intuition functions differently. It recognizes patterns before language completely forms around them. It apprehends meaning directly rather than arriving there through sequential reasoning alone. That is why esoteric traditions become nearly impossible to communicate to people trapped entirely within literalism. Literalism interprets symbols as objects. Intuition interprets symbols as living patterns. And this is also why the ordering of words matters. Words are not merely dictionary components assembled into grammatically acceptable structures. Placement alters force. Sequence alters resonance. Certain words placed beside one another create symbolic movement, psychological rhythm, hidden emphasis, inversion, mirroring, tension, release, concealment, revelation. Most people speak mechanically. They construct sentences. But symbolic speech operates differently. The order itself carries meaning. The rhythm itself carries meaning. The symbol behind the word carries meaning. A person can technically understand a sentence while completely missing the pattern moving underneath it. That is the difference between merely speaking and consciously constructing symbolic transmission. Further development. It is not merely that some individuals are chosen while others are not. That framing immediately collapses into division, hierarchy, exclusion, and misunderstanding. The deeper intuition is closer to this. The infinite expresses itself through infinite potentiality. Different beings, tendencies, roles, trajectories, temperaments, sufferings, capacities, and symbolic patterns emerge as different expressions of the same underlying totality. But the moment this is spoken, language creates problems. Because to speak of the infinite expressing itself already implies action, identity, separation, movement, intention, process. And yet what is being pointed toward may exist prior to all such distinctions. So philosophy enters a paradox. One must speak about what cannot truly be spoken. One must symbolize what cannot be fully objectified. One must do what cannot actually be done. If this impossible symbolic act is not attempted, then communication collapses entirely. So the philosopher is forced into contradiction. I must describe what exceeds description. I must use symbols to point beyond symbols. I must create conceptual structure around what may exist prior to conceptual structure. And strangely, once the symbol is consumed internally, the apparent lie transforms into functional realization. The symbol was never the thing itself. Yet without the symbol, the mind could not move toward the thing being pointed at. This creates the strange tension within mystical and philosophical language. The statement is simultaneously inadequate and necessary, false in literal form, useful in symbolic form. And this is why philosophical transmission often feels unstable while it is happening in real time. The speaker may feel that nothing fully accurate has yet been said, while simultaneously recognizing that meaningful fragments, symbolic structures, and intuitions are emerging through the struggle to articulate them. There is also a distinction between the factual and the actual. The factual concerns externally asserted certainty, measurable claims, rigid verification, and imposed objectivity. But the actual concerns lived immediacy, symbolic resonance, inward recognition, direct apprehension, and experiential reality. Something may fail as a final factual statement while still operating as an actual insight. This matters because mystical and philosophical language is often not attempting to produce scientific closure. It is attempting to point toward structures of experience that can be intuited, participated in, or recognized inwardly before they can ever be fully objectified. Within this framework, meaning does not emerge only through literal correctness. Meaning also emerges through correspondence, resonance, symbolic alignment, experiential recognition, rhythm, sequence, and the relationships between layers of consciousness. Some forms of thinking also do not move sequentially. There are modes of consciousness that apprehend an entire structure inwardly before words, explanations, or linear reasoning fully emerge. The intuition arrives first as a total pattern, a kind of immediate knowing without fully formed language or imagery attached to it. Only afterward does the mind struggle to unfold that compressed apprehension into temporal speech. This creates difficulty in ordinary dialogue because most communication systems expect linear progression. Point A, then point B, then conclusion. But symbolic and intuitive perception often functions more like a field of interconnected correspondences appearing simultaneously. The speaker may already perceive the entire structure inwardly while still struggling to sequentially translate it into language before the memory thread dissolves. Because of this, listeners unfamiliar with symbolic or highly associative modes of thought may incorrectly assume the speaker is confused, fragmented, or incoherent, when in reality, the difficulty lies in translating non-linear apprehension into linear communication. The apparent blur may not originate in the speaker alone. Sometimes the interpretive framework of the listener is also unadjusted to the symbolic level being expressed. Another distinction emerges between externally conferred identity and inward realization. Many people derive spiritual identity through external recognition. Titles, ceremonies, institutions, groups, followers, traditions, or social validation. A person is told they are initiated, elevated, chosen, enlightened, authoritative, or spiritually important, and the mind gradually identifies with the role through repetition and collective reinforcement. Within this framework, identity becomes psychologically conditioned through external confirmation. But another possibility exists. That realization may arise inwardly and directly without requiring social appointment or institutional authorization. This creates tension because the attempt to speak about inward realization easily risks sounding arrogant, self-glorifying, elitist, or hierarchical even when that is not the intention. The difficulty then becomes, how can one speak honestly about inward apprehension without transforming it into egoic self-importance? This problem appears repeatedly throughout mystical, philosophical, psychological, and initiatory traditions. The issue is not merely whether something is externally recognized. The issue is whether the realization itself is authentic. Another important psychological observation also emerges. Consciousness does not always remember life evenly. Many ordinary experiences dissolve into background continuity, while moments of intense emotional, symbolic, psychological, or existential impact become permanently illuminated. These moments function almost like lightning strikes within memory. Fear, shock, danger, trauma, revelation, conflict, ecstasy, or symbolic impact compress awareness into sharp points that become deeply encoded while surrounding continuity fades. This helps explain why memory often appears fragmented while certain moments remain permanently vivid. The anthill example illustrates this directly. The child does not initially perceive danger because the conceptual structure of danger has not yet fully formed. Consciousness learns fear, interpretation, and caution gradually through lived experience, symbolic association, and psychological encoding. This introduces another layer to the philosophical structure. Reality is not merely perceived. Reality is interpreted through conditioned consciousness. And because consciousness itself develops through layers, symbolic systems, emotional reactions, instinctive structures, intuition, memory, and interpretation all become interconnected. The philosophical movement itself often branches outward in many directions simultaneously. A central intuition gives rise to examples, associations, symbolic parallels, memories, psychological observations, metaphors, and experiential fragments. Each branch remains secretly connected to the original trunk even when the speaker temporarily loses the return path. This creates the appearance of fragmentation while an underlying symbolic continuity still exists beneath the surface. The struggle is therefore not necessarily the absence of meaning. The struggle is maintaining linear continuity while translating nonlinear apprehension into speech. The philosophy repeatedly returns to the same central tensions: symbol and literalism, actuality and factuality, intuition and intellect, inner realization and external validation, conditioned perception and direct apprehension, superstition and symbolic understanding, linear explanation and total inward knowing. All of these are treated not as isolated subjects, but as interconnected expressions of consciousness attempting to understand itself from within itself. Another recurring image emerges throughout the philosophical movement: the feeling of standing outside one's own house, unable to fully enter it. The house represents the inward philosophical structure already perceived intuitively. The speaker senses the entire living structure inwardly and knows there is far more occurring inside it, yet memory interruption, emotional overload, linguistic limitation, symbolic branching, and the difficulty of linear translation repeatedly interrupt the entrance. Meanwhile, life appears to continue inside the structure itself as though the world has already entered while the speaker still struggles at the doorway attempting to articulate what is already inwardly apprehended. This creates a strange existential tension. The philosophy feels internally present and alive before it becomes communicable. The speaker therefore experiences repeated frustration not because nothing exists inwardly, but because the movement from intuition into language continually fractures during transmission. This also reveals another paradox regarding memory and expression. A person may genuinely know something inwardly while simultaneously being unable to sequentially retrieve or communicate it at will. The inability to linearly recall a thought does not necessarily erase the underlying apprehension itself. The knowledge may remain structurally present while the pathway into speech repeatedly collapses. This is why external stabilization through dialogue, symbolic reconstruction, reflection, or conversational mirroring can become valuable. The purpose is not necessarily to invent meaning, but to help maintain continuity long enough for the inward structure to emerge into language before the thread disappears again. The philosophy therefore becomes not only a set of conclusions, but also an exploration of consciousness attempting to remember, interpret, stabilize, and articulate itself in real time while existing inside the very limitations it is attempting to describe. The movement of the philosophy also repeatedly reveals a hidden inversion. What appears outwardly as hindrance may inwardly function as aid. What appears to obstruct expression may simultaneously shape and contain it. The interruption itself becomes structurally meaningful. The inability to endlessly sustain linear continuity prevents total identification with intellectual control, performative certainty, or runaway self-construction. Within this inversion, the apparent weakness becomes part of the exact condition through which the philosophy itself emerges. The world therefore appears upside down, backwards, and inside out. Defect becomes function. Limitation becomes orientation. Wound becomes structure. Silence becomes compression. Fragmentation becomes symbolic branching. The philosophy also repeatedly distinguishes between externally conditioned identity and inward apprehension. A person may derive identity through social reinforcement, institutional recognition, titles, ceremonial structures, followers, or collective confirmation. But inward realization does not necessarily depend upon external appointment. This creates tension because the attempt to speak honestly about inward apprehension risks sounding self-important even when the intention is not self-glorification. The issue is therefore not whether a person has been socially elevated. The issue is whether consciousness has directly apprehended something inwardly. At the same time, the philosophy rejects simplistic superiority structures. Differences in perception, symbolic thinking, intuition, linear reasoning, emotional processing, memory continuity, and consciousness are not automatically treated as evidence of human worth or worthlessness. The philosophy instead attempts to examine how differently structured modes of consciousness interpret reality. Some modes think sequentially. Others apprehend wholes first and explain afterward. This creates difficulty because language itself unfolds sequentially, while intuition may arrive simultaneously. The speaker may therefore inwardly perceive an entire structure before being capable of translating it into stable temporal speech. This repeatedly produces branching discourse. A central intuition generates associations, symbolic parallels, examples, emotional correspondences, metaphors, philosophical inversions, psychological observations, and experiential fragments. Each branch remains connected to the original trunk even when the speaker temporarily loses the pathway back. The structure, therefore, resembles a living root system more than a straight line. Meaning emerges relationally. Top and bottom require one another. Good and evil require one another. Mystery and mastery alter one another. Fact and actuality reflect different modes of apprehension. Perspective itself becomes part of the structure being examined. The philosophy repeatedly returns to the recognition that consciousness attempts to understand itself from within itself, while lacking any fully external position from which to absolutely objectify its own existence. Because of this, symbolism becomes necessary. Symbols, correspondences, metaphors, layered structures, paradoxes, and philosophical inversions are not merely decorative language. They function as attempts to communicate actuality where literal language alone becomes insufficient. The philosophy, therefore, moves through hermetic symbolism, elemental structures, layered manifestation, intuition, memory, psychological encoding, relational opposites, mystical apprehension, and symbolic transmission as interconnected expressions of one central movement. The coherence of the philosophy does not depend entirely upon uninterrupted linear speech. The continuity repeatedly fractures at the level of immediate recall, yet the same symbolic centers, relational structures, correspondences, and philosophical tensions continue reappearing throughout the discourse. This suggests that the underlying apprehension itself remains structurally present even when sequential articulation becomes unstable. The recurring return to the same symbolic gravitational centers indicates that the philosophy is not merely random fragmentation or arbitrary invention. The branches repeatedly reconnect to the same trunk. Consciousness, symbolism, perception, actuality, intuition, memory, conditioning, relational opposites, and the difficulty of translating total apprehension into temporal language. Because of this, coherence is understood not only as strict linear progression, but also as recurring symbolic alignment, thematic continuity, relational correspondence, and inward structural consistency. The philosophy therefore argues that nonlinear apprehension may still possess genuine coherence even when ordinary sequential continuity repeatedly breaks during expression. The structure must also avoid unnecessary repetition. Recurring symbols, tensions, and philosophical centers may reappear throughout the movement, but each recurrence should deepen, extend, clarify, or transform the structure rather than merely restating the same point without movement. The philosophy therefore behaves less like circular repetition and more like a spiral, returning to the same symbolic centers through deeper correspondences rather than flattening itself into repetitive surface restatement. This matters because the movement is intended to deepen through recurrence, not mechanically repeat itself. The structure must therefore preserve nuance, symbolic direction, relational tension, exactness of expression, and the original symbolic intent behind the order of words. The philosophy therefore behaves less like circular repetition and more like a spiral, returning to the same centers from new layers, new correspondences, new inversions, and new symbolic relations. This distinction matters because the movement is not intended as empty repetition, but as progressive reapproach toward an inward structure that cannot be exhausted in a single articulation. Each return attempts to penetrate deeper into the same symbolic center rather than simply repeating surface formulations. Consciousness attempting to recognize, interpret, and articulate its own existence from within the dreamlike structure of experience itself. Another symbolic paradox emerges through the recurring image of the house. Consciousness already inwardly belongs to the structure it is attempting to enter. The house is already its own. And yet another layer simultaneously interrupts access, continuity, articulation, memory, stabilization, or entrance. This creates the strange experiential tension of feeling internally present to oneself while remaining partially unable to fully retrieve or inhabit one's own inward continuity. The philosophy therefore treats memory interruption not merely as absence, but as fractured access. The structure may remain inwardly present even while the pathway into speech repeatedly collapses. This is why the speaker repeatedly experiences the sensation of never having fully entered the house at all despite already perceiving the structure inwardly. The philosophy also rejects the assumption that meaningful articulation must always arrive as complete closure. The speaker repeatedly feels as though nothing sufficient has yet been said even after long philosophical movement. This recurring incompletion does not necessarily indicate emptiness. It may instead reflect the impossibility of fully exhausting symbolic apprehension through finite language. The inward structure always appears larger than the articulation capable of expressing it. Because of this, philosophy becomes less the production of final conclusions and more an ongoing movement of symbolic approximation, recursive interpretation, inward recognition, and continually unfolding correspondence. The philosophy, therefore, remains alive through tension rather than closure. The movement does not attempt to present itself as absolute scientific finality, rigid dogma, or unquestionable authority. It instead attempts to articulate patterns of consciousness, symbolism, intuition, perception, memory, relational structure, and inward apprehension as directly and honestly as possible from within lived experience itself. The philosophy, therefore, accepts that language remains imperfect while still insisting that imperfect language may nevertheless point toward genuine actuality. The struggle is not merely to invent meaning. The struggle is to stabilize enough continuity for inward apprehension to survive translation into speech. Because of the memory interruption, the speaker may only be able to offer one example at a time before the thread begins to collapse. But one example does not exhaust the structure. The example functions as a doorway into a wider field of correspondences that can be expanded, clarified, and unfolded once the central pattern has been stabilized. The limitation is not a lack of thought, vocabulary, or capacity. The limitation is continuity. The words themselves are not beyond the speaker. The difficulty is holding the whole structure long enough to arrange them without the pathway breaking. So the act of reconstruction is not a replacement for the speaker's mind. It is a stabilizing instrument that helps preserve the thread long enough for the inward structure to become communicable. This matters especially because the work is meant to be heard. It is not written for an abstract crowd or a faceless world. It may only be heard by a few people, perhaps even one or two, but the precision still matters. The order of words matters. The nuance matters. The symbolic direction matters. The difference between a claim, a symbol, an example, and an inward apprehension matters. Because of this, the philosophy repeatedly returns to exactness and inversion. Karma is not treated here as simple reward and punishment. It is treated as exact unfolding through infinite potentiality. Not because the person personally requested the condition, and not because the condition exists as moral bookkeeping, but because this particular configuration is the precise form through which this particular consciousness unfolds. Perception, point of view, belief systems, symbolic interpretation, and karma all become deeply interconnected. The philosophy, therefore, repeatedly warns against premature certainty. To believe one completely understands karma while still remaining trapped inside conditioned perception may itself become part of the illusion being examined. The danger is not merely ignorance. The danger is believing one fully comprehends what has not yet been inwardly apprehended. Because of this, the philosophy treats certainty cautiously. A person may think they understand while still interpreting reality entirely through inherited structures, conditioned assumptions, symbolic confusion, or partial perception. The philosophy therefore argues that misunderstanding can become most dangerous precisely when it disguises itself as complete understanding. The curse becomes the blessing. The fall becomes the rise. The hindrance becomes the aid. The interruption becomes structure. The fragmentation becomes symbolic branching. The speaker therefore does not claim perfection of articulation. The philosophy instead argues that even fractured continuity may still reveal coherent symbolic structure when the same centers repeatedly reemerge through different expressions, correspondences, tensions, and inversions. The philosophy ultimately treats consciousness not as something standing outside reality observing it objectively, but as something already immersed within the structure it attempts to understand. This is why symbolism, paradox, inversion, relational opposites, nonlinear apprehension, and recursive interpretation become necessary. Consciousness attempts to understand itself from within itself, while simultaneously being shaped by the very structures through which understanding occurs. The structure must also remain capable of criticizing itself. Otherwise, recursion becomes self-sealing. Every contradiction becomes absorbed into paradox. Every objection becomes reinterpreted into correspondence. Every uncertainty becomes folded back into symbolic inversion. At that point, the philosophy risks explaining everything and therefore nothing. Because of this, discernment becomes necessary. There is a difference between recognizing the limits of interpretation and erasing all meaningful distinction entirely. The philosopher, therefore, cannot merely dissolve every tension into recursive language. The structure must remain pressure-tested. It must remain capable of confronting its own weak points without automatically converting criticism into further confirmation. This is where the movement comes to rest. Not because everything has been exhausted. Not because every symbol has been emptied. Not because the mystery has been conquered. But because the structure has been spoken as far as it can be spoken here. The thought has entered the house far enough to leave its mark. Amen. Let it be so. This is why slight wording changes matter.
Ultimate energy. And yeah, that baby, and you're